Hey, Steve.
Hey, Jim.
I can't believe this, but we're going to start off today's episode with a quote from Dick Clark.
Oh, wow. You mean like music is the soundtrack of your life?
Well, no, I was going to say I don't make culture, I sell it, but yours is good too. And welcome to another episode of Two Guys Talking About Records, a vinyl community podcast. My name is Jim, and I'm a record store owner.
And I'm Steve, a record collector.
I almost said record store collector. I think I'm having some allergy time here
I'm collecting
today.
record stores. I just bought another one.
Not the case, but I'm a collector too, and yes. I dig on that. And we're kind of delving into the collecting side today, talking about soundtracks. But wait, we're narrowing this down. We'll explain here in just a couple of minutes. But how was your week as far as collecting goes? What did you pick up?
Well, this week I made the mistake of visiting two different record stores in my travels. One called Phoenix Records in South Haven, Michigan, which is way on the western side of the state.
Yep.
And then Uncle Ed's Records in the tiny, tiny town of Chase. I think it's the only business in town that's open, of all places.
Did you buy any eggs while you were there?
I did. No, they sold eggs too.
I've seen their posts. Yeah. Stop down for your latest releases or a dozen farm fresh eggs.
No, I did not. But I did pick up some stuff. One of them was my most exciting thing is this record was sent to me. It's the brand new album from Belmore, and it's neoclassical. And Michael Muller, who has a channel on YouTube, and he was during the pandemic, he was a big part of it. But then, since the pandemic's over, he's now touring. I think they're getting ready to go off to Berlin and Turkey to tour his group. Well, this is their brand new album. And I became friends with him through YouTube, vinylcommunity. So he sent me his brand new album, Pendant World. It's absolutely gorgeous music. They expand their sound because basically it's guitar and piano. It's very atmospheric. So here they add other instruments into it and make it more well-rounded.
Neoclassical, though, huh?
Yeah, neoclassical. So it is a modern take on classical music. And they do have violins and cello and some other things in there.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Velvet Tears was an album I bought here. Yep. Came out in 2021, Nightmare Daydream. And that was pretty good. It's a really rocking album. Very, very nice. And you can find a lot of their videos out on YouTube. And then these are ones I brought back in my collection. I was out there looking. They're common, but these are ones I really always like. Joan Jett, I Love Rock and Roll. The Doobie Brothers, Minute by Minute. Yes, the must line, Michael McDonald singing on it. I get it, folks. But that's my first Doobie Brothers album I ever bought. Cool. And from college. Big Country, The Crossing.
That's a great one.
I've been waiting for you to bring that one in.
Haven't
done well. The Cure, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, but it is the reissue from 2013. And the box tops, the letter. I did find an original of that.
Huh.
The cover found some water damage, so I felt right at home with it. And
you're not going to want to hear this. We just cataloged a letter, an original here last week.
Son of a gun! All right.
Oh, it's not the best though. The vinyl's not very good.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, what did you bring in this week?
Well, you had a busy one. I did not. I only brought one into the collection this week, which is really odd because usually we're going through a lot. And I find stuff I like, but this one was kind of a neat one and unexpected. It was called Max Lasser's Ark is the name of the group, and the album is called Into the Rainbow. And I looked at this when we cataloged it, and it was listed as jazz, psych-ish stuff, so I threw it on. It's from 1986, so it's not psych and it's not jazz. The best thing I could equate it to is something like Spyro Gyra or the Yellow Jackets, which... is very light and airy. You said neoclassical earlier. This I would consider to be more modern jazz, but not free form in any way. It's very structured. It's just very light and airy music. And very unfamiliar with it. Had to look him up. Max Lasser is a Swiss guitarist who basically just toured and had groups there. And this is one of their only albums that he released on its own. He now works with doing some music in townships of South Africa. So it's kind of a very interesting turn. But this album, really kind of neat, very light jazz, good background music, all instrumental. Yeah. I enjoy it, and I'll toss it back there with the one other Spyro Gyra and one Yellow Jackets album that I own.
Kind of funny what comes in during the week at times, isn't it? You get some of these odd, quirky things and put it on and go, well, that one kind of speaks to me.
It is. And I had a weird week of, you talk about bringing things in. Yeah. Luckily, we slowed down. There was no new-ish collections this week coming in. That's been a trend that we'll talk about at some point down the line. But I had some time the other day when it was a little bit slower to go back and do some cleaning in some areas of the store that have been neglected for a little bit. And found some boxes of stuff that would become either the 10-cent mystery bags or the dollar bin stuff. And then I found a box that was unlabeled, and I thought, well, what the heck is this doing pushed all the way under this table here? Pulled it out. It turns out it was another box from that big Psych collection from a couple of years ago that I had forgotten about. And there's some goodies in there. So we'll talk when I get through that catalog-wise. But I do this from time to time. It's like, well, I have a finite amount of space in the store, so I'm just going to shove this box in when I bring it in because I don't have space. And then I forget about it. It's like Christmas. All of a sudden you find this box full of rare Psych. I'm like, holy cow, why didn't I get into this sooner?
Yeah, I was one of the record stores I visited this week. The owner took me back to his storeroom where they had all the boxes. He goes, and here's what we have. It's just piled because it was a lot smaller than yours. And it's stacked up there trying to find a spot for everything.
There's a method to our madness as record store owners. I mean, because of the size of the store, we can only bring out so much at one time. Yeah. And the way I like to do things is I like to kind of group things together and bring out certain genres or certain artists. So this was a pleasant surprise, and it's definitely going to be a biggie when I get into it.
Okay. Looking forward to it.
Onward to our subject this week, and we wanted to talk about soundtracks. But the caveat being, we're narrowing this down.
Yes, 2 original soundtracks. Original music that was created just for that movie, and almost all the time to enhance the movie.
I see. Now, soundtracks are great. In a lot of cases, though, they work their way into being, and I don't mean this to be insulting, but really kind of a glorified various artists compilation, where you get the, especially more modern movies that rely on contemporary music, rock and roll, urban, whatever the case may be, to really drive the point home. But the lost art of soundtracks is, as you mentioned, where you have modern composers who design sound specifically.
Think of all the movies that you have watched that, the movie's okay, but it was that soundtrack. And that soundtrack took a good movie and made it into a great movie because that composer did such an incredible job of bringing in the feel for what's going on and relaying the emotion of that to you in the audience. And that's what I really love about original soundtracks. When they do it right, it sticks with you forever.
It's almost something too that you don't really notice because it's not an intrusive part of the film. And I think that's, I used to teach film and television, and for me, a soundtrack is something that is a complement that goes with everything. Most people watching films aren't going to notice fantastic cinematography or a great soundtrack or great acting because they're so immersed in the film itself. When you do notice these things, it's like, well, that sounded weird or that looked odd. Why? Now, I can be wrong in this because I do recognize great cinematography and great music in movies, but I'd like to think maybe I'm the odd side out in that because I'm always looking for that stuff.
Yeah, and I'm not. I'm just sitting there, and oftentimes, because of my love for music, the soundtrack, as I'm watching the movies, one of the first things that comes to me, and I'm sitting there with my wife, and go, did you hear that? Did you hear the music? And my wife could care less about music, and I'm going on about that music that I'm hearing, and she just looks at me, what are you talking about?
Now, the process for this has really changed, I think, a lot over the years, and I go back to... it's an older film. It's from the 80s. It's called RKO 281, and it is a movie about the making of and the controversy surrounding the making of Citizen Kane. And there's a scene in the movie where the actor portraying Orson Welles is in on the soundtracking sessions. And it's a large theater type of thing where they've got the film projected on a screen and a full orchestra going through as the conductor creates the score is written by then, but they're creating and recording this while they're watching the film to make little changes, and they've got the director in there with them. Now, that wasn't the scene. It just happens to be that that's what they were doing while Orson Welles was arguing with someone about Citizen Kane. But to me, that is really kind of the root way to do this. You're seeing these visuals, and the conductor and the composer are all together creating this at the same time.
Unless you're someone like me that would be playing and then I start watching the movie and just kind of losing track of where I'm at. Wow, that's a really good scene, and suddenly miss my whole trumpet part that was supposed to be in there. Maybe that's why they don't do it anymore, because there's just too many people that just couldn't focus.
Well, and this brings us to the idea then is a way for us to enjoy these movies again. Well, of course, we could always watch them because there's everything streaming nowadays. But soundtrack albums of this nature still exist. They're still created for new movies and a lot of video games, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
But these go back as long as movies go back as well, and vinyl together. They went together very nicely for decades and decades.
And they used to sell millions.
Yep.
I mean, they would outsell almost any other, kind of type of music, but that's because you went to the movies. That was a big part of your life, while now it's not. Again, you wait for it to come on TV, and I don't think it has that same feel, with a lot of the soundtracks now, because back then it was just, your night out, you're bringing the family, and now it's, we'll go on the couch and watch it. So
we can also say it's the best of both worlds, too, because we love vinyl a great deal. The music is there, but the covers, the jackets, the sleeves, the imagery is all part of it. Now, all of a sudden, we've got this jacket and sleeve imagery that reflects the film that we enjoy as well.
Yes, very true.
So we're looking at today some of our favorite soundtracks. These are the original scores, not music of. That sounds like a good one for a later date.
It is. And definitely one that we need to go, because there is some phenomenal soundtracks that go that way too, that just they put together the greatest songs in the world, and it's like a greatest hits package.
Well, for my list, I really don't have anything chronological. I've got them grouped, and I'm going to throw you a couple of curveballs a little bit later. But let's start off with what you've got here, and what you hold up as the epitome of a great motion picture soundtrack.
I do have mine here chronological, because it's really a part of my life. And the very first one, it was a soundtrack called Grand Prix. And I think the movie came out in 63, 64. It was one of the first movies I really remember going to, because my mother loved James Gardner and he was in it. So that's why we went. I hadn't a clue. But it was about Grand Prix auto racing. I became a lifelong fan of auto racing because of that movie at about the age of 5.
Wow.
It had such an impact. But Maurice Jarre, I don't know, it's French. Jarre, he composed this, and it has that real, that classic 60s feel that, so often you can think of your bachelor pad music. You can go back to that. That's kind of fun and quirky. But the whole soundtrack was built, obviously around this movie, and it really encompasses. There's a French feel to it, but they also bring in like the sounds of the cars, and and to hear these engines from these Grand Prix type cars just firing up. I mean, it just gives me goosebumps. But beautiful soundtrack, very French sounding, because it takes place for the most part in France. But that thing meant a lot to me. Great stuff.
Now, one of my first, and I still own this copy, soundtracks is this. It's the same type of story of yours. I'm going to have to think back here. When I was probably about 10 or 11, I saw Star Wars.
I had that. I used to have that. Oh my God, yes.
John Williams soundtrack, and the album for it reflected that, right on down to the cantina scene where this great big orchestral soundtrack takes a complete 180, and you hear this strange alien music from the bar scene, the cantina scene from Star Wars. So that, for me, is one of my earlier soundtracks, and from a movie that I absolutely adored as a kid. let's not get into what it is now, but
But just think how that opened. I mean,
yeah.
right at the open, you had the screen. You had the scrolling words, but it didn't matter. It was that score which John Williams is a master at scoring. It just, you were, I mean, how many soundtracks did they sell of that just because of that opening in itself?
getting goosebumps here thinking about just how powerful those first
Oh
notes
my
hit the
God,
screen
it
were.
was. It was amazing. Wow. Yeah, I wrote that because I used to have that, but I don't have it anymore.
We'll find you one.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, I know you will. The next one was Vertical from Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, Bernard Herrmann wrote a lot of scores for Alfred Hitchcock, and they're just classics. North by Northwest, Psycho. But Vertical was, I mean, he really brought in the suspense of that. The way the violins went, circled around and almost made you dizzy. You got vertical with it.
Was the point.
It was, and it was such a beautiful score. And I watched the movie. Had Grace? No, did that one have Grace Kelly?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you go on that. But it was just this soundtrack took you into it, and Herman it was one of the most beautiful soundtracks. And to this day, to me, it doesn't feel dated. I put that on, and it was that soundtrack after the flood that I really wanted to get back quickly because I just think it's absolutely gorgeous.
Same era for me, and we've talked about this soundtrack before. It's Duke Ellington in the soundtrack Anatomy of a Murder. This was an Otto Preminger film, and it featured one of the first soundtracks in the 60s, early 60s, to be done and composed entirely by an African-American artist, Duke Ellington. Ellington even appeared in the film as a fictional jazz musician playing in a bar that the characters had gone to. So he was a part of the film on screen, but also composed the entire soundtrack, which is just some really great and haunting jazz.
Yeah, you loaned me that one out, and it's very, very good, most enjoyable. The next one, this is from the late 60s, 68 or 69.
Yeah.
Wah, wah. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Yep.
Just iconic soundtrack. I think one of the greatest, well, obviously, it's one of the greatest soundtracks ever made because I'm talking about it. It was another case where if you took the music out of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, the movie, it just wouldn't be right. I mean, it would be kind of boring. Is okay, but the music is what brought in the fight scenes. It created such tension within that movie, and without that music, without that score from Morricone, which again a genius at the soundtrack, the movie would have been nothing. And that's with all the spaghetti westerns. Morricone, when he was doing that music, made those spaghetti westerns into something special. But nothing. He did nothing nearly, to me, as good as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's in your brain forever.
I was going to say, it's one of those musical riffs that sticks with you and is instantly recognizable. Funny you should bring up the Clint Eastwood side of things, though, because a couple of other soundtracks in my collection are Clint Eastwood oriented.
Okay.
Nothing with Morricone in this case, but the soundtrack to Paint Your Wagon, which was a Clint Eastwood film with Lee Marvin, where they sing. So it's Clint Eastwood singing. It's every bit as good as you would think it would be. But the Kish value of it for me is very cool. It's got some orchestration to it. I don't know the composer, but just notable because you've got Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin, two big burly manly men in the 60s Western genre and other action films, singing on Paint Your Wagon.
Just kind of makes me think of Monty Python, and I'm a lumberjack,
There
and
we
I'm
go.
okay.
One other Clint Eastwood one, and I'm skipping off the Westerns for this. And just because, and this is another point we can make, it sometimes we'll get soundtracks just because we like the movie. Mm-hmm. This is a guy's movie, and it's one of those things like with the Three Stooges. My wife says, I don't get it. Why do you like those? But Kelly's Heroes, the World War II film with Clint Eastwood, Telly Savalas, Don Rickles. I got myself a copy of that soundtrack, and it's just as cheesy. It's got kind of that 60s pop feel to it, where they're attempting to copy the style of Morricone in the Westerns, because at its heart, Kelly's Heroes it's a heist film, but it's a Western at the same time. that takes place in World War II. So that's a fun one to have simply because I really enjoy that movie.
I've watched that a billion times. It used to be on every year. Hey kids, back when we used to have only 3 channels to go at. Kelly's Heroes, The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, always on every year.
There we go. So now we're getting a little more modern.
Yes. Now it goes. This is from a TV show, but it is an original soundtrack score from Angelo Badalamenti. It's Twin Peaks, and Twin Peaks really set the bar for any kind of soundtrack on a TV show. It created. It's scary.
Yep.
I mean, it's eerie. It's weird, but it encapsulates what is happening on that show so perfectly. And when you hear it, you know immediately. I mean, just right away, this is Twin Peaks.
Well, it had to be twisted because of David Lynch.
Yes, it does. And, he had worked with Badalamenti earlier on Blue Velvet.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And so they're really twisted, right? So this soundtrack was, so they came in knowing what they wanted to do, and they were sitting down. It kind of also was the beginning of what you could call it like dream pop, because Julie Cruz was brought in, and it started really making that genre a lot bigger. You kind of had through the Cocteau Twins and stuff, but this gave it some legs, and it is my favorite soundtrack. I mean, I love that series, but it was one of those, the music made it twice as good.
Now, I've got one comparable to that, but it's from a film that probably I have only seen, maybe a few other people, and if you have, then kudos to you. It's called Psychos in Love. This is just one of the most terrible movies of all time, where it's a riff on Hitchcock, but then it gets a little more weird. It comes from the 70s, 80s era of schlock B-movie filmmaking.
Yeah.
And the soundtrack is very reflective of that. Now, the main characters, by the way, they're each psychotic serial killers, and then they meet intending to kill each other, but then they find the common ground that makes them fall in love with each other. It's not killing, it's the fact that they hate grapes. Which is the reason for their killing spree. So I don't want to go too far into it. Look the movie up if you need to. The soundtrack is horrible, just like the film, but I have it for some reason.
Oh, God. The last one came out a couple years ago. It's La La Land from Justin Hurwitz. I actually got an autographed copy here.
Cool.
And I just thought it was just a fun movie. It was just a fun soundtrack. It was full of color. It was energetic. It was one of these with dancing and singing and everything going on. It was just, I put it on and I smile. It makes you feel good. And, it's more than a soundtrack. I mean, it can hold itself as an album, and you don't even need to have the film to even know about the film. In itself, it just makes a great album.
And that is cool because, again, when you like the film, I think that really enhances your love or desire for a soundtrack.
Yeah.
Now, it's tough for me to, with so much going on upstairs with everything else, retain knowledge of composers, with the exception of the big few like Morricone or Williams. Mm-hmm. But one of the names that sticks out for me is Carter Burwell. And his stuff on vinyl is very difficult to find. Carter Burwell is a composer who has worked a great deal with the Coen brothers, who are very, very influential in my filmmaking side of things. Yeah. I enjoy their movies a great deal. The top of the list being, of course, like The Big Lebowski and Raising Arizona and some more contemporary ones. Big Lebowski is a soundtrack, but that's not one we're discussing today because it's a compilation of other people's music that come in there. But something like Raising Arizona, which Burwell did, one of his first ones that he made for the Coen brothers, I think it was Blood Simple or Miller's Cross. No, Blood Simple was his first one with them. But Raising Arizona was kind of this quasi-Western soundtrack with yodeling throughout. In fact, the yodel theme used to be my ringtone on my telephone for the longest time. I like that movie so much. But as a standalone entity, the soundtrack doesn't exist. It's on vinyl, mind you, but it's combined with another film of theirs. I think it's Miller's Crossing. So one side is a few things from there. So this is a soundtrack that's ripe for the reissuing, in my opinion, that I'd love to see.
Yeah, but I can never find that. I looked forever.
You see Raising Arizona, and I forget which it's paired with, so it's like one side for each of the two Coen films. But more recently, I mean, the Coens did, and Burwell worked with them on Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And I wasn't going to bring that one up because that is still a compilation of music from other folks, but still, that's a movie that music is tremendously important throughout the film. But very recently, they did a streaming piece called The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which was another Western, and it's a compilation of short set pieces by the Coens, and Carter Burwell did the music for that, and it's got that very good, just fun Western feel to it. And although it's not a musical, there is one musical number with Tim Blake Nelson singing in a barroom after he dispatches a bad guy. And Carter Burwell is responsible for this. Yeah. And I had to bring up the lyrics to this because the character that was offed by Tim Blake Nelson's Buster Scruggs in this film was named Surly Joe. And the song on the album, and I do own the album, by the way, the Ballad of Buster Scruggs soundtrack, it's called Little Joe the Wrangler, or in parentheses, Surly Joe. And after he's dispatched by the main character, the Tim Blake Nelson Buster Scruggs began singing, and one of the lines that he gets the entire bar room singing with is Surly Joe, and then the bar room echoes back Surly Joe, Surly Joe, Surly Joe, won't be missed by anyone, will Surly Joe. Humankind he frowned upon, but now his face is gone, guess your frowning days are done, oh Surly Joe, yeehaw. So if you've seen that film, you'll understand it, but that's just a very fun soundtrack. And it's not all comedy, by the way. It's some of the film gets tremendously serious, and that is reflected in Burwell's stuff as well. But, Burwell has done so much work for the Coens that it's great to be able to find the stuff. I just wish that they would be able to do more. Things like the Hudsucker Proxy had kind of a great 50s retro feel as a film. The soundtrack, the same thing, but it's only on compact disc. So that's one of my wants down the line, is that Carter Burwell gets the recognition on vinyl that he is deserved.
He just did movies I have no clue about. But, when a producer, for instance, you can go back to Hitchcock with Herman. This is the person I like. They get me. They understand what I'm doing. So similar with the Coen brothers. Here's the person that gets what we're trying to do in our humor.
And he's worked so much with them. Burwell also, by the way, did the music for Being John Malkovich with Spike Jonze, which is just a totally bizarro out there film. I want to throw you a curveball next. Okay, so we're limiting this to original scores, or not so much scores, but I think you said earlier music that is created for the film.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on Spinal Tap?
Oh, that is, yes. That was a group made just for the film.
Yep.
They made the music just for that. Yes, it was, satirical, making fun of other things, but it was an original film score.
They learned how to play the instruments specifically for the film. Christopher Guest, Michael McKean, and Harry Shearer, the core of Spinal Tap. They did the same thing with a folk type parody called A Mighty Wind.
Yeah, that's
the same
funny.
thing there. But I would count that. I think it defies that genre because it's not a greatest hits, or not a greatest hits, but a various artists rather compilation. It's them, and it was created for the film. It's just not a traditional score that you'd think of.
No, it's not. It doesn't. It is. It's almost like it's its own group. Spinal Tap. You put it in under S, not in the soundtrack section. This is there's Spinal Tap.
One of the others that comes to mind with this, and this is another one that kind of walks that tightrope in here. It's Simon and Garfunkel and the album The Graduate, the soundtrack to The Graduate. Some of their biggest, Mrs. Robinson and the Sounds of Silence was on that. I'm trying to think. No, The Graduate was on there. Some of this is orchestral composition. Some of it is Simon and Garfunkel created for the film. So I think that's another one that walks that line.
Yeah, that would, because I think no one seems to find, you usually find it within the Simon and Garfunkel section, is that it was just a big part of their music.
And it's part of their catalog.
Yeah.
Then the only other two curveballs, so to speak, is Pink Floyd's More.
Yeah.
It's a studio album, but it's a soundtrack. Okay, but they were into that kind of weird 60s filmmaking at that time. And the music that went along with it. So kind of like what they did in the never fully released film of Pompeii.
Yes.
So, and then one more. It's Pink Floyd. I have an album called The Film.
Okay.
And now you'd think, okay, Pink Floyd's album The Wall is not a soundtrack. It was a movie, but the movie came about because of the album.
Yeah.
And the album itself does not feature all of the music that is in the movie The Wall. Well, I've got a bootleg that represents all of the music in The Wall, and it's simply called The Film. And it's some of the songs. It's the songs that are on the album, but it's the film versions that may have some audio or sound clips in them, as well as some of the other songs that did not make the album but were in the film.
I think that would then be an official soundtrack.
It would count, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. It would.
Let's talk for a second about some more modern soundtrack makers. And there's a few companies out there that we deal with here at the store. We try to get their stuff in that make phenomenal soundtracks. Companies like Mondo, they do T-shirts and posters, but Mondo soundtracks. They're connected with Light in the Attic, which is another great soundtracking record label, and Waxworks, which really specializes in horror movie soundtracks, whether they be older or newer horror movies. Any of these labels, if you find vinyl on them, not only is it absolutely gorgeous in presentation because they redo the artwork on these things, but they hold their value tremendously.
Yeah, I when Mondo puts something out, boy, it goes fast. I've tried to. There's been a few I've tried to get. It just they seem to sell out so quick, and to get it on the secondary market, the price just gets jacked way
into the
up.
triple digits. One of my favorite Mondos, I know it doesn't do well for podcast listeners, but I'm showing Steve, is my soundtrack to The Fifth Element, the Bruce Willis film. And Mondo did a reissue of that. It's on kind of orange and white striped vinyl. And I couldn't tell you the composer without having to look at it. I've listened to it once or twice, but I really enjoy the film, and I really enjoy the soundtrack. And the packaging that Mondo did on this was just fantastic.
It's gorgeous. Eric Serra is
the
name of the person. And yeah, the packaging is absolutely beautiful. It's cartoon, so it's not like taken from the movie with Bruce Willis. This is more of a beautiful artwork and drawings.
And that's what Mondo really is kind of specialized in. The other two really big Mondo ones that I've got that I'm really proud of are from Shaun of the Dead. This is the Edgar Wright trilogy, Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. And each of them are on colored vinyl in their own respect. Each of them have that type of artwork on the cover, which is not just pictures of the film. It's actually artist interpretations of the film. And those are really cool. I've listened to them once or twice, but that's just fun stuff to have.
I'm the Shaun of the Dead. Well, actually, both those movies were hilarious. I just never saw that ever coming out, and you got in, you found them, and you got them quick. And obviously now they're probably way up there in pricing.
Now, the Edgar Wright films, Shaun of the Dead and then Hot Fuzz, they're actually part of a trilogy. I don't know if you knew this. It's called the Cornetto Trilogy, basically meaning that somewhere in each of these films, one of the characters eats this British ice cream treat called a cornetto.
Oh, okay.
So it's in Shaun of the Dead, and it is in Hot Fuzz, and it's also in a film called The World's End.
Yeah,
so
I
this,
saw that.
Yeah, this was the third of this trilogy, and I have been waiting and waiting and waiting for Mondo to come up with a soundtrack to complete this trilogy, and it's been years. It's been rumored, and it better be on blue vinyl. If you've seen the film, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But this is one of those ones that's important to me to kind of get that, because I enjoy Wright's stuff. I enjoy the trilogy. Now I want that third soundtrack from Mondo, darn it.
Well, I think it's time for a writing campaign. Hey, everyone out there, just start writing Mondo. There's what we want. Let's get it going.
So soundtrack-wise, if you've got a favorite, please let us know in the comments, either on the YouTube channel or send us a comment on either Steve's YouTube channel or ours. And I think there is some commenting allowed on the Podbean side of things. I don't know if there is on Spotify, but...
Yeah, I'm not sure. But yes, a Podbean.
We're still learning.
Yes.
We're still learning. But there are some folks that are reaching out via the YouTube comments as well, and we'll get to those and try to address them. But I'm very curious to see what you think about soundtracks and what is impactful. I mean, the question I'll leave you with, Steve, is it more important to have a great soundtrack for a mediocre film? Does that make the film better? Or like Cycles in Love?
Yeah.
Or is it just the whole package for you?
For me, the soundtrack is important, very important. If it's a great soundtrack, I really don't care about the film because I'm listening to the music. My wife would totally disagree with that 110%. But me, a great soundtrack is extremely important, and it can make any kind of film much, much better.
On that note, and I'm going to back up a little bit, and I should have thought of this earlier. One of the other Coen films that I'm a big fan of that Carter Burwell was involved with was No Country for Old Men. Notable for the fact that it has essentially no soundtrack. And yet Carter Burwell is listed. I had to look this up. Out of the film, which is probably about 2 hours long, with the end credits included, there is only 16 minutes of music in the film. And then the rest of it is silence and natural sound.
Isn't that something? Wow. Okay.
So if I wait for my Carter Burwell soundtracks and I finally get the No Country for Old Men, it's going to be about 16 minutes long.
It'll be an EP. a 45.
There we go, for sound quality.
Yes.
All right, Steve. Well, thank you all very much for listening. Sometime down the line, we'll finish this up and talk about the various artist soundtracks, because that's just as important, too.
It is, and it's a lot of fun.
So much fun. All right, until then, we will talk to you next time. Check out Steve on his channel.
Yep, Steve Carlson, Vinyl Community.
And look for us at Radio Wasteland Records and Radio Wasteland Records YouTube channel and RadioWasteland.com, and all over the place, I guess, is where I'm trying to get. All right, Steve, you have a great week. Thanks for being here.
And you also, Jim. Thanks a lot.